welcome to the Smarkets Politics Podcast, episode 7, and yet our third Prime Minister here in the UK. We're going to talk about that and Rishi Sunak's taking over at number 10 and how that's affected the markets. We'll also be looking ahead to the second round of the Brazilian election coming up this Sunday, and of course the US midterms, which are next week. And we've also got a special guest alongside my regulars, Matthew Shattuck and Patrick Finn. We've got Matt Singh from Number Cruncher Politics on the line. We're going to start, though, here in the studio with Patrick, because, Patrick, you're going to tell us about Rishi Sunak's entry into number 10 and what that means for the markets we've got on when he might leave, how things will go over the next few months. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so there's a 24% chance that Sunak leaves his post by the end of next year, which, interestingly, is around the same position that Truss was in when she first took office, despite Sunak's much stronger position with the Parliamentary Conservative Party. So I thought that was interesting, why the market isn't any more confident about his chances of lasting than it was when Truss became PM. And similarly, in terms of the next leader market, not a lot has changed. And this is probably because Sunak hasn't made a lot of changes to the top team, and nor are these like internal Tory divisions just suddenly resolved. So just giving an example, like the top 4 in the market after Truss took over were Kwasi Kwarteng, Kemi Badenoch, Boris Johnson and Penny Mordaunt. Now, Kwarteng's career in high office is finished, but the other 3 are actually still the top 3 in the next Tory leader market after Rishi Sunak. So, I mean, I guess from the market perspective, at least, this feels like a reset for the Tories, a chance to kind of redo the last 2 months, but it's not considered a breakthrough moment or any radical break with the past. So yeah, I suspect we might start seeing some Labour leads, maybe in the high teens rather than the high 20s and 30s, but not any poll leads for the Tories just yet.
Okay, first chance to bring you in, Matt Singh. We've seen a lot, and kind of Patrick alluded to it. There's been this sort of huge lead for the Labour Party, sort of a lead that some people are calling a kind of existential threat to the Tories if there were a general election right now. How likely do you think that the Tories recover some of that kind of polling deficit and that they recover?
It's a very good question, and there are not a huge amount of historical precedents to go on. Obviously, leaders have been changed in mid-term, but to have 2 changes of not just party leadership but Prime Minister in such short succession, and also the scale and speed of the polling move against the Conservatives after the mini budget really puts us in quite a unique situation. So we've had one poll, that voting intention poll, done completely after Rishi Sunak took over as Prime Minister. That was YouGov for today's Times. And that showed, it had previously shown a 37-point Labour lead. That's now down to a 28-point Labour lead. Now, that's not a huge bounce if that's all it is, but given all of the things I just mentioned, it's quite possible that there's more to come. It takes longer for the effect of the last few weeks on the Conservatives and in particular on their brand to wear off and for them to recover. Certainly Sunak's personal numbers relative to Starmer don't look too bad. He's behind, but not massively so. And of course, this is the point at which governing parties in sort of the third year of a parliament, where the governing parties are usually at their least popular. So there are, and of course, the other thing to remember is that this has been probably the most volatile parliament in terms of voting intention that I can remember. It was only sort of 3-4 years ago that we were talking about how stable the polls were. This parliament, we've had 30-plus point leads and vote shares in the mid-50s for both main parties at different times. Now, I'm quite sure that the next general election is going to end up somewhere, very much somewhere between the two, but where exactly is hard to say. I mean, the question really is whether the Conservative brand is so damaged by the events of the last few weeks, combined with the costs of governing. And bear in mind, they have been in for 12 years now, and it will probably be 14, I would think, by the time that there's another general election. And so, yeah, they will they will find it difficult to claw back the ground that they've lost, but it's not impossible. We don't know what's going to happen with, for example, the economy or Ukraine, for example, which would lead on to the economy. And there are still, I mean, despite Labour's huge lead, it does have some brand problems of its own, which might be exposed if they come up against a governing party or government that the public view as more competent and more palatable. So it is quite hard to say. I mean, I guess you would say the likeliest outcome at this point is that they don't claw it all back, but there's a very wide uncertainty around that. I feel like I've said that a lot over the last few years, but I think right now it is very much justified.
Yeah, I mean, 2 years is a very long time in politics these days, I guess, is what we have to hold in mind. Matthew, obviously, we're talking about 2 years' time, a general election will need to be called in that period of time. It hasn't happened before. But how plausible is it, do you think, that there is an election next year? And because that would probably be a lot riskier for the Conservatives.
Yeah, I mean, the odds have been creeping up. I think right now they're saying about a 25% chance of a 2023 general election. I did give this a bit of thought the other day. I mean, I think I'd be a seller rather than a buyer at that rate. I guess there's two broad ranges of possibilities here. Either the Tories claw back an enormous amount of this poll lead, so they're close to even or perhaps ahead. Now, as Matt says, that's a big lead, and it's probably quite unlikely to happen within 12 months. So I don't think we're going to get to a situation, well, maybe I'll allocate a 10% chance the Tories are in a position where they think they can win and therefore gamble on an early election. I suppose the other range of possibilities is things are going so badly, changing leaders may not be an option, given they've already changed it twice in this parliament already. And perhaps they run into some huge parliamentary mess. They lose a vote of no confidence. The only way out of the situation is an early general election. Theoretically, that's possible. Not many historical examples of governments doing that. So I'm going to say that's about a 5% chance. So in my head, about a 15% chance of an election next year, 25% selling markets. Therefore, I'm selling.
Okay, so there's another tip, an early tip from Matthew Shandek. Matt, we'll come back to you down the line. We obviously didn't have a contest in the end that went to the members. Penny Mordaunt pulling out just before the kind of deadline. If it had been Boris Johnson up against Rishi Sunak in that membership vote, who do you think would have won that?
Well, we'll never know for certain, but we do have some good clues from a poll of the Conservative members that YouGov did. This was just before the leadership election was actually called from Liz Truss announcing her resignation. So it was hypothetical, although I guess given the circumstances, it was perhaps less hypothetical than might normally be the case. They did not, unfortunately, ask the head-to-heads, or at least didn't publish them. So we can't answer the question directly. They did ask first preferences across a range of candidates. Now, on that question, Boris Johnson got 32%, Rishi Sunak 23% of first preferences. Obviously, the problem with that is that 40-odd% went to other people, and we don't know how the lower preferences would have broken if that had been the head-to-head. But they did ask about whether they felt people would be a good choice or a bad choice, or I can't remember the exact wording, but they asked people to rate the candidates individually. And on that, Boris Johnson had 63% saying that he would be good, Rishi Sunak 60%, and I think Penny Mordaunt was in the mid-50s and the others somewhat lower. So I think between those two pieces of data, we can conclude that Boris Johnson probably would have won, but I think it would have been relatively close.
Okay,
yeah,
very interesting.
I'm with Matt on this. I mean, I'm a bit sad that we didn't get that runoff. Just from a sort of professional point of view, it would have been an amazing market for a week. But yeah, I think everyone had assumed, a lot of the media commentary was Boris will win with the members. And I'm with Matt, I think it would have been close, because I think the effect of having a MP's indicative vote, where Sunak would have been at least 2-1 ahead of Johnson, based on what we know, perhaps further, that would have played a big part. I think that would have changed a few people's minds. And don't forget, Sunak got 43% in the last one in the summer. Mm-hmm. And his standing had obviously risen since then, because his predictions about what would happen if Truss took over proved very prescient. So I don't think there's any reason to think he wouldn't have got very close to 50%, if not above. Yeah,
interesting. I mean, 43%, but he was, obviously up against Truss. The idea being that Johnson is more popular, or supposedly more popular with the membership. But yeah, very interesting, and kind of thing perhaps that you might have been able to model quite well, Patrick.
Yeah. Well, actually, just on what Matt said, Matt Singh, got two Matts on today. The leadership approval ratings between Truss and Sunak were quite a good predictor of what the kind of headline head-to-head figures were. So that kind of difference, if it was like +4 to Johnson or whatever, is probably a good indication of what the poll margins might have shown. But whether the polls would have actually been accurate is a different question.
Okay, very interesting.
That is a good point, actually, because in the first leadership contest, the polls were off by a margin that, in the event didn't actually change the outcome or even come close to. But in normal circumstances, that would be a big miss. And if you think it's going to be closer, then that would be. I don't know if YouGov, they didn't say if they changed any methodology or anything, but I think that's quite relevant.
I really wish somebody would run a retrospective poll of members to say, how would you have voted if this had happened?
Yeah, that would be interesting. No, we don't do party members polling ourselves, but there are a few people who do, so that would be interesting.
Okay, gents. Well, yeah, very interesting, but for now, hypothetical. But we can move on to the US, and we have another kind of divergence between the polls and the betting markets, really, and it's a good place to kind of discuss that. We'll start with you, Patrick, as well on this. Again, we've got a lot of the kind of poll-based forecasters, those who build those models, saying that the Democrats look very likely to take the Senate. The betting market's saying the opposite.
Yeah, just to clarify that, like the poll-based forecasters are a little bit more cautious on the Democrats at the moment. So 538 is putting the Democrats at 54% chance of holding the Senate.
Okay, so it's come in.
Yes, yeah.
I'm on the old numbers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And Smarkets is giving the Democrats a 35% chance. I just recall Nate Silver writing an article about 10 days ago about how the betting markets were being too confident on the Republicans, but now it seems like the markets picked up on this kind of Democratic slump that's been happening before the poll aggregators did. But I mean, that could just be a coincidence. It's kind of hard to say which one is more reliable because we don't have like a lot of evidence to say either way. But there is some anecdotal evidence of the markets outperforming the polls in the US presidential election, the last UK election, and the local elections this year. We did quite well at Smarkets. But I think the one key advantage the markets have for all the flaws of markets is immediacy. So markets can pick up on big campaign moments in real time if there's a big event. So the markets will respond in real time, whereas getting a new poll can take 2 or 3 days. And even then, you're not sure if it's just noise in the data until you get a few more polls as well, which could take another few days after that. And probably perfect timing for this podcast. There was what may come to be seen as a major event in the Pennsylvania Senate race just a couple of days ago with a debate between the two Senate candidates. Usually these kind of debates are just run-of-the-mill occurrences and don't have any major impact on the race, but many commentators are suggesting that Senate control could hinge on this particular race. I think Matthew's been looking at...
Yeah, you talked about this last week, didn't you? It was John Fetterman against Dr. Mehmet Oz. And, how has that kind of affected the market, that debate?
Yeah, Patrick's saying the advantage of betting markets is they can just react quicker, which is true, but also they can be a bit forward-looking. And so we knew this debate was happening. John Fetterman, the Democratic candidate, is recovering from a stroke, and so most people had assumed he would struggle in this debate. He did somewhat, I guess, by most people's estimates. And so the markets could build that in. We're going to have a debate. This is probably going to be bad for the Democrats. Therefore, we can adjust our expectations. And, of course, polls and forecasts are mainly, if not exclusively, backward-looking. So we've got this interesting situation where Fetterman has led in almost every single poll, with maybe one exception. And yet Dr. Oz, the Republican candidate, is the fairly strong betting market candidate. So it's quite a nice contrast case study in how these things can change.
John Fetterman kind of led in our market from kind of May until about a week ago.
Yep.
Okay. We'll throw it over to you, Matt. Is there something about the US polling there that you think is kind of mirrors this situation we have in the UK, where sometimes there's that contrast between the betting markets and the polling aggregates in a kind of more generic way?
Well, it's interesting. In the US, there has not traditionally been a consistent directional bias in polling. I remember 538 had this thing a few years ago where they looked at it over multiple cycles, and on that, if you average across all of them, it ended up being basically nothing. There was nothing like the consistent sort of being skewed towards Labour like we had in the UK up until the last decade, when it sort of evened out a lot more. So that's how it's traditionally been. I mean, the first thing to say about the difference between the poll-based models and the market implied probabilities now is that they're perhaps not that as different as they might look. So certainly on the Pennsylvania Senate that Patrick was talking about, it's 538's model last night had 60-40 in favour of the Democrats. I think your prices are actually not quite even 60-40 for the Republicans. I think it's come in slightly since then. I mean, that is really, when we've got a race as close as this, that's the difference between a 1.5 point Democratic lead and a 1.5 point Republican lead. In terms of polling error or possible polling changes between now and the vote, we're not actually talking about that big a difference. And out of interest, I looked at the National Generic House votes, and it looks like that's not something specific to Pennsylvania, because in the for the House, the 538 poll-based model has got about 80% chance for the Republicans, and I think the market prices are just somewhere under 90%. So it's not something unique to Pennsylvania. I mean, in terms of other markets possibly anticipating the polls being skewed to the left and the Republicans doing better, possibly. We've had, as I said, traditionally there hasn't been a consistent directional bias, but we've now had two presidential elections in a row where, to a small extent nationally and certainly in the swing states, the Republicans, or Trump specifically, has ended up doing better than the polls said he would in those places. So, I mean, I'm not sure if I would assume that's going to happen again, but I guess if you're building in some probability of that, then you would say possibly you'd expect the Republicans to do a bit better. And that's what some people may be building in. I don't personally have a strong view on that at that point, but I think that might be what's happening.
Yeah, we had a not dissimilar thing happen in Brazil. Lula going into that first round with a very big poll lead, heavily tipped by Matthew. But the actual kind of first round results were a lot closer than we anticipated. Patrick, we've got that kind of second round, that runoff coming up on Sunday. It's Lula, of course, up against the incumbent Bolsonaro. Now got a kind of clearer sense of what the market's saying about that second round.
Yeah.
It has moved around a fair bit in the last
few
weeks.
It has, actually. It's currently at a 67% chance of a Lula win. The market seemed to move massively in Bolsonaro's favour last week, and I'm not sure there was any particular reason why. So that there was actually a point where I thought Bolsonaro was about to go favourite. I think at its peak he was at 47%, but that's now come back towards Lula, putting him at about a 2 in 3 chance. I saw someone point out on Twitter that it might be because the English language Wikipedia page hadn't updated the polls recently, and it looked like Bolsonaro was doing better than he actually was. But yeah, just on the polls, like they have, since the first round at least, they've moved in Bolsonaro's favour by about 1 or 2 points, but they do seem to have stabilised at the moment. So I think at the moment we're probably looking at something like 52-48 to Lula on average.
Okay. And Matt, coming back to you, a kind of similar question to the last one. Is there a kind of consistent skewing that we see in Brazilian polling?
Yeah, in Brazil, unlike the US, there is a relatively consistent historical skew for the left to underperform its polls, and that was the same when they were up against the main competition was from the centre right, and it's the same now against Bolsonaro. Some of the Brazilian pollsters do seem to be blaming late swing in the first round, so that would explain the polls for the second round also coming in. Whether it's that or it's some other kind of skew in the polling that's then been corrected by weighting it to the first round result, I'm not sure. You would imagine that the second round polls would be more accurate than the first round polls, given that they've got this, even if they're not weighting to it, they've at least got this benchmark. But again, as Patrick said, it's about a 4-point lead for Lula in most of these polling averages, and the polls would not have to be very wrong, or things would not have to move very much for him to lose. Again, I think 67% probability was the last market price I saw. I mean, that's not over. I mean, that's lower probability than a penalty being scored in football, right? So it's kind of like, I mean, it 67% may sound like a high probability, but it's not anywhere near a sort of a shoo-in. I would need to look more closely at the data to decide, whether that's consistent with what the polls are showing, given the possibility of a bias. But yeah, I certainly would not be. I would not be touching that sort of race lightly at the moment. You need to have a look.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brazil and the US markets are exhibiting something which we've talked about before, which is, I think, a lot of political gamblers look at pretty much any election, any set of polls, and assume that you'll probably make money by assuming the right will do better than the polls suggest. Some international evidence that this has happened sometimes, doesn't always happen. And my personal approach is that I think the markets always, or quite often, overstate that possibility, which is why I often find myself backing left-wing candidates in lots of elections, because I'm kind of assuming that they're overrated. In fact, I've had a small bet on the Democrats to win the Senate this week, because I think it's just gone a little bit too far.
Okay. For those wondering, a penalty is about 75-80% chance. So, yeah, it's a very apt analogy.
As well,
let's end then with our regular section. Put your mouth where your money is. Of course, you did kind of tip quite heavily. I'm sorry to bring it up, Matt, that Lula victory. I mean, you could still, of course, be right. Have you had any bets on the Brazilian election in the last week? Anything you'd like to tell us about?
I'm all maxed out. I just cannot have any more money on Lula. Even when he got to sort of 1.7, 1.8 last week, I just can't afford to risk any more money on this one. So I'm sitting that one out in terms of having any more bets on it. As I said, I did back the Democrats to win the Senate, just because I think the odds have gone a little bit too far. And whilst I haven't bet in places,
what were the odds that you got for the Senate race?
40% Democrats win. And I haven't had many bets in any of the individual races. But if the Republicans get stronger in places like Pennsylvania or Georgia's more or less a toss-up now, I'm going to be quite tempted to bet Dems there as well.
Okay. How about you, Patrick?
Yeah, quite similar to Matthew, actually. I didn't want to put any more money into the Brazilian market. I've actually cashed out a little bit by backing Bolsonaro. But yeah, also, as Matthew tipped earlier, I cashed out of a 2023 election by laying that after that came in, after Sunak got elected. But not much more from me this week.
Okay. Right. Well, we're going to leave it there then. Thank you very much to Matt Singh from Number Cruncher Politics for joining us. Thanks, of course, as ever, to Patrick Flynn and Matthew Shaddock. We'll be back next week. If you are watching on YouTube, do give us a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you're watching on any other platform, please subscribe and follow. See you next week.